By late November 1944, the stratosphere above the Japanese home islands had become the most expensive and frustrating theater of the entire Second World War, a frozen, rarefied battlefield where the United States Army Air Forces were currently losing a humiliating war not against the Imperial Japanese Navy, but against the physics of the atmosphere itself. At the center of this debacle was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, a sleek silver leviathan that represented the absolute zenith of American industrial prowess, a pressurized aluminum tube that had cost the American taxpayer $3 billion to develop, more than the entire Manhattan Project, and was designed around a singular, arrogant doctrine that high-altitude, daylight precision bombing could destroy an enemy nation without the muddy trench warfare of the past. To Captain James Miller, clutching the yoke of a B-29 nicknamed the Big Stick at 32,000 feet above Tokyo, the promise of the brochure felt like a cruel joke. For while the outside air temperature was a lethal 60 degrees below zero, inside the heated, pressurized cabin, the sweat was stinging his eyes as he fought to keep the 60-ton bomber flying straight in a slipstream that defied all aeronautical logic. Miller and the hundreds of other crews of the 21st Bomber Command had discovered a terrifying meteorological phenomenon that the meteorologists had not predicted: the jet stream, a massive river of air rushing from the Himalayas across the Pacific at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, a force so violent that it turned the B-29's advanced navigation computers into useless paperweights. On this particular mission to destroy the Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashino engine plant, the flagship target of the campaign, Miller watched his ground speed indicator spike to a terrifying 450 knots as they flew downwind, moving so fast across the Earth that the highly touted Norden bomb sight, an analog computer of gears and mirrors that was supposed to be able to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, could not physically rotate its optics fast enough to track the target. The bombardier in the nose was screaming over the interphone that the crosswinds were pushing the aircraft at a crab angle of 25 degrees, meaning the plane was flying sideways just to move forward. And when the release point finally came, the physics of the drop were hopeless. The bombs fell from the bays, but the moment they hit the howling wall of the jet stream, they were scattered like handfuls of confetti thrown into a hurricane, drifting miles off course to explode harmlessly in rice paddies or empty residential blocks, leaving the factory complex virtually untouched. But the wind was only half the nightmare. The other half was the machine itself, specifically the four massive Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines that powered the Superfortress, intricate beasts of magnesium and steel that were pushed to their absolute thermal limits to haul the heavy payloads to such extreme altitudes. As Miller throttled back to try and stabilize the bomb run, the cylinder head temperature gauge on the number 3 engine redlined, a precursor to the B-29's most lethal flaw, the tendency of the magnesium crankcase to catch fire when overheated, creating a blaze so hot it could burn through the aluminum wing spar in seconds, snapping the wing off like a dry twig. The crew lived in a state of constant paranoid listening, waiting for the telltale vibration or the shout of fire from the scanners in the blisters, knowing that if an engine ignited at this altitude, the hydraulic systems would fail and the pressurized cabin would become a coffin. The mission was a failure before they even turned back toward the Marianas, a fact that was becoming painfully clear to Brigadier General Haywood Hansell back at the headquarters on Saipan, a man whose face was gray with the stress of watching the Superfortress become a super disaster. Hansell was a true believer in the doctrine of precision bombing, a disciple of the idea that destroying key industrial nodes, ball bearing factories, aircraft engine plants would surgically cripple the enemy, But the reconnaissance photos landing on his desk were a damning indictment of his philosophy, showing cratered fields and pristine factories. The pressure from Washington was becoming suffocating. General Hap Arnold, the commander of the Army Air Forces, had staked his entire reputation and the future independence of the Air Force on the success of the B-29, bypassing the theater commanders to control the weapon directly from the Pentagon. And now he was demanding results that the weather and the technology were refusing to provide. The Japanese defenders were almost an afterthought. The real enemy was the altitude, the wind, and the engines. And as 1944 bled into 1945, the morale of the crews plummeted along with their accuracy, leading to a grim realization among the brass that the billion-dollar gamble was failing. The B-29 was the most advanced weapon ever built, but it was being used in a way that ignored the reality of the Japanese environment. And unless something radical changed, unless someone was willing to commit the heresy of abandoning the high-altitude doctrine, the war in the Pacific would drag on for years, measured in the wasted lives of airmen falling from the sky in burning silver crosses. The stage was set for a change in command, for a shift from the idealism of precision to the brutality of results. But for now, Captain Miller just prayed that his number 3 engine would hold together long enough to reach the endless blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean, leaving the untouched factories of Tokyo fading into the clouds behind him, a mocking testament to the limits of American technology. The arrival of Major General Curtis Emerson LeMay on the island of Guam in January 1945 felt less like a change of command and more like a hostile corporate takeover of the 21st Bomber Command, as the cigar-chomping, taciturn general stepped off his transport plane to relieve the aristocratic and idealistic Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, bringing with him a reputation for brutality that had been forged in the flak-filled skies over Regensburg and Schweinfurt. LeMay was the antithesis of the dashing airman. He was a cold, unsmiling pragmatist who viewed war as an industrial engineering problem, where the only metric that mattered was the ratio of tonnage dropped to targets destroyed. And as he settled into his Spartan Quonset hut headquarters, filling the air with the acrid smoke of his ever-present cigar, he immediately began to dissect the failure of the B-29 campaign with the dispassionate precision of a coroner performing an autopsy. He studied the strike photos from the recent raids on the Nakajima aircraft plants, noting the scattershot impact patterns caused by the jet stream winds, and he read the maintenance logs detailing the catastrophic engine failures caused by the strain of hauling heavy payloads to 30,000 feet, quickly concluding that the current doctrine of high-altitude precision bombing was not just failing, it was a delusional fantasy that was costing American lives without shortening the war. LeMay turned his attention to the intelligence reports regarding the structure of Japanese industry, and it was here that he had his grim epiphany, realizing that treating Tokyo like Berlin was a strategic error because the Japanese war economy was not concentrated in massive, concrete industrial parks, but was dispersed like a nervous system throughout the wooden residential districts of the cities. The intelligence revealed the existence of shadow factories, thousands of small, family-run machine shops located in the back rooms of paper and wood houses in the Shitamachi downtown districts, where civilians produced aircraft parts and munitions on drill presses sitting next to their sleeping mats, creating a decentralized supply chain that could not be knocked out by hitting a single large factory complex. To destroy this target, LeMay realized he didn't need high explosives to shatter concrete. He needed fire to burn the city to the ground, and to do that effectively, he had to make a decision that violated every safety protocol in the Army Air Force's handbook. He looked at the meteorological data and saw that the ferocious jet stream winds that plagued the bombers at 30,000 feet were non-existent at low altitudes, and he noted that the B-29's engines which were prone to overheating in the thin air of the stratosphere, ran cool and efficient at 5,000 feet, burning far less fuel and allowing for a massive increase in bomb load. However, flying a B-29 at 5,000 feet meant bringing the massive, slow bomber within range of every anti-aircraft gun and rifle in the Japanese arsenal, a tactical suicide mission according to conventional wisdom. But LeMay, staring at the ceiling of his hut through the blue haze of smoke, wagered his career and the lives of 3,000 men on a single, crucial piece of intelligence. The Japanese night fighter force was virtually non-existent, and their heavy anti-aircraft guns were manually aimed and incapable of tracking low-flying targets moving at speed in the dark. It was a gamble of staggering proportions, and LeMay decided to double down on the risk by issuing an order that made his staff officers go pale with horror. Not only would the bombers fly low and at night, but they would also be stripped of all their defensive armament. He ordered the removal of the General Electric remote-controlled gun turrets, the removal of the ammunition, and the removal of the gunners themselves, leaving only the tail gunner as a lookout, a radical weight-saving measure that stripped 3,000 pounds of steel from the airframe and allowed each plane to carry an additional 1.5 tons of the new M69 incendiary clusters. When his operations officers protested that sending unarmed bombers over the enemy capital at low altitude was tantamount to murder, LeMay silenced them with a stare that was colder than the high-altitude winds, explaining that if his calculations were correct, the speed and surprise would be their armor, and if he was wrong, he would be fully prepared to face the court-martial that would inevitably follow the slaughter. This was the cold calculus of total war. LeMay wasn't interested in the morality of burning a city or the safety of his crews in the abstract. He was interested in results, and he was prepared to turn the most sophisticated precision weapon in the world into a blunt instrument of mass arson to get them. As the orders were typed up for Operation Meeting House, the target was set for the dense, working-class district of Tokyo, and the date was set for the night of March 9th, marking the moment when the U.S. Air Force abandoned the pretense of surgical strikes and embraced the logic of the firestorm, led by a man who didn't care if history judged him as a monster, as long as it judged him as a winner. The first week of March 1945, on the coral runways of the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, was defined by a pervasive atmosphere of confusion that quickly curdled into a mutinous dread as the rumor mill began to churn out stories that sounded so tactically insane they could only be the product of a command staff that had finally cracked under the pressure. On the flight lines of the 313th Bombardment Wing, Captain Miller stood in stunned silence as he watched a team of ground crew swarm over his aircraft, the Big Stick, but they were not there to load it or fuel it. They were there to eviscerate it. The order had come down directly from LeMay's headquarters with the force of a divine edict. Every B-29 participating in the upcoming mission was to be stripped of its defensive armament, a directive that involved the physical removal of the General Electric remote-controlled gun turrets, the sophisticated computer-aided sighting blisters, and every single round of 50-caliber ammunition, leaving only the tail gunner's lonely twin mount as a token gesture of defense. To men like Miller, who had been trained for 2 years to believe that the B-29's porcupine array of guns was the only thing keeping them alive against the Japanese Zeros, this was not just a modification, it was a death sentence. The airmen gathered in the briefing huts, their faces pale and sweating in the tropical heat, listening as the intelligence officers pulled back the curtains to reveal the flight profile for Operation Meeting House. When the briefing officer announced the bombing altitude, not the standard 30,000 feet, but a suicidal 5,000 to 7,000 feet, a collective gasp sucked the oxygen out of the room, followed by an uproar of angry shouting. They were being told to fly the largest, most expensive target in the world at an altitude where they could be hit by everything from heavy flak down to a soldier with a good rifle arm. The logic was explained to them in cold, hard numbers. Flying low meant bypassing the jet stream and saving fuel, and removing the guns and ammunition stripped nearly 3,000 pounds of dead weight from the airframe, weight that LeMay intended to replace pound for pound with incendiaries. But the logic did little to quell the fear. The crews felt they were being sent into a meat grinder, sacrificed by a general who was desperate to save his own career by throwing bodies at the problem. While the crews wrote grim letters home, the armorers began the deadly work of loading the payload that would replace the guns, transforming the B-29s from precision instruments into blunt force cargo trucks of arson. The weapon of choice was the M69 incendiary, a sinister little device developed by Standard Oil that looked deceptively harmless, a 6-pound steel pipe filled with a gelatinous mixture of gasoline and thickeners known as napalm. These weren't the massive high-explosive blockbusters used in Europe. They were cluster munitions, packed into 500-pound aimable clusters designated E-46. Each cluster held dozens of the M69s, which were designed to break apart at 2,000 feet, releasing a rain of the smaller bomblets that would crash through the flimsy tile roofs of Japanese houses. Once inside the structure, a delayed fuse would ignite a black powder charge, ejecting a glob of burning napalm that would stick to walls, floors, and furniture, burning at intense temperatures that water could not extinguish. The armorers used hoists to winch ton after ton of these clusters into the dual bomb bays of the superfortresses, overloading the planes to a gross weight of 135,000 pounds, far beyond the manufacturer's recommended limits. The landing gears compressed under the strain until the tires bulged and the engines were tuned to run rich, preparing to haul the massive load off the runway in the dense, humid night air. Captain Miller walked around his plane for the pre-flight inspection, running his hand over the aluminum skin where the gun turrets had been. The holes had been plated over with sheet metal to reduce drag, giving the B-29 a sleek aerodynamic look that felt dangerously naked. Without the weight of the guns and the high-altitude climb, the plane would be faster, cruising at nearly 300 miles per hour, but speed was cold comfort when you were flying low enough to smell the smoke of the fires you started. The live flight was a cacophony of activity, as 325 bombers were prepped, the largest armada ever assembled in the Pacific, yet there was a heavy, somber mood among the men. They checked their parachutes and flak vests with obsessive care, knowing that if they were shot down at 5,000 feet, there would be no time to glide and no time to bail out. They would simply ride the burning wreckage into the streets of Tokyo. LeMay had stripped them of their shield and handed them a sword of fire, betting everything that the Japanese defenses were as hollow as his intelligence officers claimed. As the sun began to set on March 9, 1945, painting the sky in colors that eerily presaged the inferno to come, Miller climbed the ladder into the cockpit, looking at his co-pilot with a grim resignation. The silver giants were ready, stripped of their defenses and loaded with enough chemical energy to boil a lake, waiting for the signal to launch into the dark unknown of the low-level night. The takeoff roll was a terrifying testament to the laws of physics stretched to their breaking point as Captain Miller pushed the throttles of the Big Stick to full military power, the 4 right engines screaming in protest against the humid tropical air of Tinian. The overloaded bomber, heavy with 6 tons of napalm and fuel, consumed nearly every inch of the 8,500-foot coral runway, lurching into the black void of the Pacific only moments before the wheels would have clipped the jungle at the cliff's edge. For the next 7 hours, the armada of 325 B-29s droned northward in a loose stream rather than a tight formation, a ghost fleet moving through the darkness without lights or radio chatter. As they approached the coast of Honshu, the sensation of flight was radically different from the high-altitude missions of the past. Instead of the sluggish, freezing controls of the stratosphere, The air at 5,000 feet was thick and rich with oxygen, making the massive planes responsive and allowing the engines to run with a cool, rhythmic efficiency that felt unnaturally smooth. Miller watched the altimeter unwind, descending from the cruising altitude to the attack height, a needle settling on 5,000 feet, an altitude that felt suicidal to a man used to looking down on clouds. Below them, the sprawling metropolis of Tokyo lay under a blanket of silence, its blackout discipline perfect, unaware that the mathematics of its destruction had already been calculated. The first to arrive were the Pathfinders, the elite crews whose job was not to destroy, but to illuminate. At shortly after midnight on March 10, they crossed the coast and opened their bomb bays, dropping not explosives, but M47 chemical bombs, which burst upon impact, creating a rectangle of searing white-hot fire that marked the boundaries of the target zone, the Shitamachi district, a densely packed grid of wooden row houses and paper workshops that was the industrial nervous system of the city. Miller, arriving minutes later in the mainstream, saw the target not as a radar blip, but as a growing orange scar on the velvet darkness of the earth. As the big stick crossed the initial point, the crew braced for the inevitable wall of flak, but LeMay's gamble paid off with a precision that was almost supernatural. The Japanese anti-aircraft batteries, trained and fused for high-altitude interceptors, were caught completely off guard, their shells bursting harmlessly thousands of feet above the bombers, while the dreaded night fighters were nowhere to be seen, grounded by a lack of radar and confusion. The B-29s were essentially unopposed. Miller's bombardier peered through the Norden sight, which was now almost unnecessary given the size of the target, and toggled the release. The aircraft jumped upward as 7 tons of M69 clusters fell away, the retaining bands popping open at 2,000 feet to release a rain of 38 caliber metal tubes that glittered in the firelight like metallic confetti. Below, the physics of the M69 took over. The weighted nose of each tube punched through the tile roofs of the wooden houses, coming to rest on the tatami mats of living rooms and workshops. 3 seconds later, the ejection charge fired, spewing a glob of burning napalm against the walls, igniting the paper screens and dry timber instantly. In a matter of minutes, thousands of individual house fires merged, fed by a stiff surface wind that began to suck oxygen into the center of the conflagration, creating a self-sustaining firestorm, the akakaze, or red wind. From the cockpit, the scene transformed from a military operation into a vision of hell that defied comprehension. The individual fires linked arms to form a tsunami of flame that rolled across the Sumida River, boiling the water and trapping tens of thousands of civilians in a cage of heat that reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The air turbulence became violent, not from weather, but from the sheer thermal energy rising from the burning city. The B-29s were tossed around like leaves in a gale, some flipping inverted by the updrafts, their spars groaning under the G-forces. Miller fought the yoke with both hands, his eyes watering from smoke that was not coming from his engines, but was being sucked into the cabin pressurization system from the outside. It was the smell of burning wood, paper, and, unmistakably, burning flesh, a visceral, sickening scent that filled the high-tech cockpit, erasing the distance between the bomber and the victim. The tail gunner reported that the glow of the city was so bright he could read his logbook by it, a crimson dawn created in the middle of the night that cast long, dancing shadows inside the fuselage. There was no need for instruments anymore. The entire world below was fire. As Miller banked the plane to turn for home, looking back at the 16 square miles of inferno that had once been a city, the crew sat in stunned silence, realizing that the concept of precision bombing had died in the flames, replaced by a method of warfare so total and so ruthless that it rendered the enemy not defeated, but erased. The sun that rose over Tokyo on the morning of March 10, 1945, did not illuminate a city, but rather a vast, silent moonscape of gray ash and charred timber that stretched from the banks of the Sumida River to the horizon. A scene of desolation so absolute that it resembled the surface of a dead planet. The firestorm had burned itself out not because of the efforts of the fire brigades, which had been vaporized along with their equipment, but simply because there was nothing left to burn. The Akakaze had consumed 16 square miles of the capital, incinerating over 250,000 structures and killing an estimated 100,000 human beings in a span of 6 hours, a death toll higher than the atomic bombings of Hiroshima or Nagasaki would later claim. On the ground, the silence was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the crackle of cooling embers and the wind whistling through the skeletons of concrete buildings that stood like tombstones in a graveyard of ash. The paper city of the Shitamachi had been erased, and with it, the shadow factories that LeMay had targeted. The drill presses and lathes melted into unrecognizable puddles of steel alongside the bones of the families who operated them. Thousands of miles away on Guam, General LeMay stood on the tarmac of the North Field, watching the B-29s limp back from the mission, their silver skins stained with soot, and their crews stepping onto the coral with the 1,000-yard stare of men who had witnessed the end of the world. There was no jubilation, no backslapping celebration of victory. The airmen were silent, haunted by the turbulence that had smelled of death, wiping the grime from their faces as they processed the transition from soldiers to executioners. When the reconnaissance planes returned with the post-strike photos, the results were laid out on the long table in the Quonset hut, revealing a void where the heart of the Japanese war machine had been. The photos showed complete annihilation. The target area was 100% destroyed, a level of efficiency that the high-altitude precision raids had never even approached in months of trying. The staff officers looked at the images with a mixture of professional awe and moral nausea, but LeMay looked at them with the cold satisfaction of an engineer who had finally solved a complex equation. He had proven his theory. The Japanese defenses were hollow, the low-level tactics worked, and the incendiary bomb was the ultimate weapon against the Japanese urban infrastructure. The gamble had paid off, but the cost was a fundamental shift in the moral gravity of the war. LeMay knew that he would be branded a war criminal if the United States lost, a fact he later admitted to his confidants. But he also knew that this method of warfare was the only way to force a surrender without a ground invasion that would cost 1 million American lives. He wasted no time in capitalizing on the success. Before the smoke had even cleared over Tokyo, he was already drawing up the target lists for the next raids, circling Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe on the map with the same dispassionate resolve. The Night of the Red Wind was not an anomaly. It was the prototype for a campaign of systematic destruction that would see 67 Japanese cities burned to the ground over the next 5 months, creating a refugee crisis of millions and starving the Japanese industry of the ability to produce so much as a bolt. As the debriefing concluded and the exhausted crews drifted off to their barracks to try and sleep without dreaming of fire, LeMay remained alone with his maps, the architect of a new kind of total war where the distinction between combatant and civilian had been consumed by the flames. The B-29, once a failing high-tech experiment, had found its terrible purpose, and the devil's wind that had blown through Tokyo was only the first breath of the storm that would eventually burn the Empire of Japan into the history books, leaving behind only the ashes of its ambition and the terrifying lesson that in the pursuit of victory, there is no limit to the violence a nation can justify.